film, and thanks for all the subscribers who tuned in to watch as well. So for Q&A, we're very lucky to have my colleague Sharif Abdel Kouddous, myself, and also Alexis Daloumis and Guy Steward. Alexis is the maker of the film, and he was featured in the film. You saw him quite prominently. Guy was also a fighter in the YPG, and he's also featured there as well too. So, we have a bunch of questions from paid subscribers, but I wanted to start with a question for both of you, Guy and Alexis as well. So I mentioned I was just in Syria, in Damascus recently, and obviously there were very significant changes that have happened in Syria in the last month with the fall of the previous central government in the country. And this issue of what's going to happen now in Rojava is very, very at the front of mind of people. I was just curious, your film obviously deals with some historic events now of the war against ISIS and the formation of this sort of political project in northern Syria. What's going on right now in Rojava, and what is the situation with the fall of the Assad regime, and how is that impacting or expected to impact Rojava as a political project?
I can take that. So what's happening now basically is, as soon as Assad fell and HTS sort of pressed down into Damascus, the Turkish regime got their proxies to attack Manbij and Sheba north of Aleppo, and sort of resulting in about anywhere from like 100 to 150,000 internally displaced people moving towards northeastern Syria, sort of by Kobani and Komishlo and other places. And now the main battle that's happening is around the Tishrin Dam and fronts to the southwest of it. And basically, the fight has been taken outside of the city to minimize casualties and for other military reasons. But we're hoping to see a deal maybe be reached soon, and possibly, or hopefully, I should say, some sort of deal where the SDF is incorporated into the Syrian military. And that's the best we can hope for.
I actually want to ask also to both of you, just to back up a bit. We heard the voices of other fighters who joined IFB, what prompted them to come, their political ideologies, their motivations, but we didn't actually hear from you. To volunteer for this, to go, take part in a fight in a foreign country.
Obviously, I've done this many times before, and I always, or most of the time, I start with a certain disclaimer, which I want to put forward here. And this is, first of all, to say that, I was a soldier and I made this film, but I do want to clarify, and I'm open to answer all questions. I just want everyone to keep in mind that I do not consider myself like a super expert on the subject matter. I'm not an academic scholar, like a professor of international relations or like Middle Eastern affairs or anything like that. I'm not a diplomat. I'm not a politician, and I'm neither a journalist with decades of experience in covering the Middle East. So with that in mind, I am, however, a journalist of much lesser experience. And in that capacity, I did reach out today to a couple of different sources from like two different directions. So I just a little earlier spoke with Matt Broomfield, who is currently reporting from the ground in northeast Syria. On the one hand, and also I reached out to a certain group who has been issuing what we would effectively call dispatches, but also some political analysis along with that for a while now, and they have quite a bit of a following in that regard, who are known as anarchists in northeast Syria. They gave me a little bit of current insight and certain views and information. And I will be incorporating a little bit of that, even maybe a few quotes into my responses tonight, rather. So in regards to your question, I would say, well, there was a little bit of a particularity in my case. I would say, in comparison to many other, to the stories of many other volunteers, and that particularity kind of boils down to me like being Greek and living in Greece, because as the film mentions, something rather uncommon was sort of happening here, which is that like in broad daylight, in the middle of Athens, in the Polytechnic school, in the dead center of Athens, there was an open event attended by like hundreds of people, a couple of hundred people maybe, that was, announcing the formation of the IFB, and quite openly asking for recruitment, like quite openly, suggesting for people to join. So while for most people, or a good amount of people, this was a little bit more of a slightly more of a more individual journey, or let's say more mediated. In any case, as they say, you send an email to the YPG, and sort of like I never sent an email to anybody, because there was a lot of this. How to say? It was quite near me. There was a lot of this going on in my immediate environment, so it was kind of close to me, and I think that's worth mentioning. And further than that, like I guess what is also kind of mentioned and reflected in the film, this felt like the main sort of revolution, like a real revolution in our lifetime. And as I also do mention in the film, I wanted to take this opportunity, given that I was in a position that I could do this, to witness and defend like a real revolution, having spent most of my life being politically active in this kind of direction. Yeah, it seemed like a unique opportunity to reach almost an ultimate level of practice of the kind of ideology I had been involved in, and the kind of politics.
Yeah,
and I guess.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Guy. Continue.
Oh, I was going to say, for me, very similar. And basically, I just not how I got around to it. I got around to it through Kobani and sort of understanding the larger Kurdish struggle for a long time, and then seeing slow report backs after the Battle of Kobani about like the revolution on the ground, and sort of reading more into it and understanding it. But similar to Nestor, I spent maybe the 5 years before that. I went when I was 22, and I started activism or politics when I was 17. So
Nestor.
Oh,
that's
Alexis.
Okay.
Alexis,
that's fine.
I'm sorry. Yeah,
that's fine. That's especially for tonight. That's fine.
Okay. But yeah, I was also interested in seeing sort of the highest level of what we were practicing, because like I got this poster actually on the first day of Occupy, and as we all know how that sort of went in a lot of things in the Arab Spring, there wasn't really anything that could defend its own political project. So I was very interested in what a political project that was defended would look like.
Oh, let me also add one thing that I strangely forgot, that because people also ask me this quite often. It was also making the film was a very big part of my motivation, and it was part of the plan for the very beginning. It's not something that sort of occurred along the way or anything. It was like an integral part of the plan from the very first moment I thought about going.
Got it. So we have a bunch of questions from audience and paid subscribers and just general viewers. I wanted to get into a few of them. The first one, someone asked, is the SDF, and I guess they're referring to there's multiple different terminologies I guess were used for the organizations that were the Kurdish-led forces fighting ISIS at the time, but they're asking, is the SDF, which is I think the predominant one at the moment, is it organized along Kurdish, Arab, or Alawite lines, different ethnic lines? And can you speak to how these groups are organized to work together in peace in the future? So I think the question is kind of getting at like how does the SDF deal with the issue of ethnicity, given that Syria is a very heterogeneous country?
This is a good question. Do you mind if I start, Guy?
Sure, man.
So this is also kind of an issue, like definitely worth mentioning, especially now, which the whole affair is all over the media, and kind of unfortunately, let's say, it is most often the SDF and the DANS is referred to as like the Kurds, or in the best case scenario, the Kurdish-led coalition, or something along those lines. Which is, I will say, okay, because I've actually been in this situation even with people that were like organizing my screenings, and it is understandable to a certain extent, from, like, let's say, an almost sort of marketing perspective, or not even just market, like address, let's say, in the sense of that maybe this is, I don't know, in many cases a better sort of brand recognition for the public, like something more understandable or something like this. But it is it is pragmatically an error, like to refer to DNS like that, and to the SDF in particular. Many people don't realize this, but uh, in most likelihood, because it's difficult to have like a proper like census, but by all accounts and by all evidence, by now, and not even by now, already by 2019, and there's an academic paper about it, and I can even provide the link later on in the comments, or however you like, is in fact a majority Arab force. Like there is it like the SDF has been also like very successful in incorporating and recruiting the local populations, and there's also like Christians and Armenians, Yazidis, Turkmens, even within this force. And having said that, it's not like it is at the same time a rather unified force. So I would note that it is. It is kind of inaccurate to refer to either the SDF or the DNS as like a Kurdish thing, or the Kurds, or anything along those lines.
And I guess I would just add on to that as discussed in the film, one of the pillars of democratic confederalism is autonomy, and within that, with social ecology, which is sort of a Bookchinite understanding of how many different ethnicities and religions can get together. And so there's all different levels in society, in civil society and in the military, where there's a completely separate function for any group that wishes to be separate. So like Armenians can go to Armenian school and learn Armenian and live their lives and practice their religion, where Turkmen can do the same, and Circassians and Syriacs. And with the larger communities like Armenians or Syriacs especially, they have their own militias that then interface within the SDF. So there's both like mixed units, I guess you could say, in the regular SDF, where there's like Kurds, Arabs, Turkmen, everyone. I could list 20 different ethnicities and maybe 5 different religions. But the main thing is that they all have the ability, when they choose to and when they have enough people and resources, to form their own military wings. And that's sort of how the monopoly of violence, to Alexis' point, is never really in the hands of like Kurds. It's in the hands of everyone, and it's sort of a very unique thing in the world. I mean, I'm not an expert on the Middle East, but it's unique in New York. It'd be unique anywhere.
I also wanted to ask you, I mean, the film very interestingly goes into really the politics of, as you mentioned, in practice, and also ideologies as well, and how they manifest on the ground. And then, in the fight against ISIS, you're fighting on the same side as groups like the YPG, which received significant US backing, which is an imperial power. And were there discussions amongst yourselves about that kind of political terrain? And I'm curious to know, was that something that was coming up?
You want to start?
Yeah, sure.
I have a few things to say on this, but let's start with this one.
Gotcha. So I guess obviously, especially in the IFB, where it's a Maoist, Marxist-Leninist, and communard-led battalion. That is a very large point of interest and understanding. But I think for the people there, when you zoom out, you sort of understand that you're either being funded by America or you're being funded by Russia and Iran. And in the SDF's case, because it's been around so long, and the military gains of the soldiers, irregardless of sort of the wider military funding, has led to a situation where since 2018 or 2019, we had military cooperation with Russia and Assad. And we also, at the same time, would be receiving weapons from the US. So I think it is very hard for people to understand when they're not there, like the idea that, oh, this is like all our guns are American, they're our main funder. But in actuality, literally everyone is funding everyone and making deals and trading. You know, we used to get like vegetables and meat that would be from Western Syria because of the sanctions. Obviously, you can't import a lot in, but it would go through Daesh territory and then to us to eat. Like the economic and military situation in the civil war is very complex, and I think for the people there, it's understood that, like, you know, Trump or Obama or anyone, like, it's just a temporary friend, and it's just they're just giving us what they give us and nothing more. If you want to take it, Alexis, from there.
Yeah. Well, first of all, in continuing Guy's point, and as a sort of a thematic sentence in this, every inner force in Syria is somehow has the backing of an outside force, either a regional or a global power. Every single one. That's just how the game is played, and this is like true for all forces, including obviously the former government, the former regime, rather. Now, another thing though that is important to mention here is, and we need to sort of even like sort of, you know, go back a bit and remember, let's say like 10 years ago, about this is not like this the US-led coalition, because it's not the US, yeah, it's a broader coalition, and that was not just in paper. Like, I myself have witnessed French troops on the ground, and in fact not like sitting in some head, like returning from operation, and not just like drones or planes and so on. But this support of the international coalition to the SDF is not how it all started. The US in particular, in the beginning, supported the so-called FSA. And the fact of the matter is that this just didn't work out for them, or for anyone for that matter. Like, this was kind of a fiasco in the sense that a lot of the equipment was like ending up in the hands of Daesh and things like that. And also by the sheer fact that like the FSA was a little bit of a loose thing. Like, it was an amalgamation of you know, different groups, and without, also often without great coordination, and without a lot of military success for that matter. So what actually happened is, and at this point again, it is important to like sort of go back in time and like remember like the situation back then, because we do have an almost unprecedented historical context here, which is that there is a pretty much unprecedented global consensus that this thing called ISIS is way beyond the pale. Like, is like the most pure, like the purest form of political evil that the world has seen since the Nazis, or something along those lines. And I would even add, in fact, if you actually think about it, it's maybe even more so than the Nazis, because actually the Nazis had a lot of sympathizers and allies for that matter. It's not like Japan supported ISIS, you know. So given that, like, there had to be, it was kind of a, you know, a necessity that there had to be a force on the ground found that could actually defeat ISIS, that could stand up to ISIS. And practically the only option was the then YPG sort of, you know, transforming into SDF right around that time. and in that sense, you could argue that the support of the international coalition against ISIS was effectively won in the battleground. Like it was a forced option. Like it was the only option that the only choice that the world had to do what had to be done. This is, I think, like an important factor in all of this.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, and to your point, Alexis, you made a good point that the SDF is not a purely Kurdish or even predominantly Kurdish force in its composition. But given that there's this profound change happening in Syria at the moment, when I was there, I was, the SDF and what's going to happen was very much focal point of discussion because the new government seems to want to consolidate power over the whole country. Meanwhile, obviously, they have these autonomous zones that were created during the war, and the SDF has a lot of arms from that time as well too, so it has some sort of leverage. And there's also U.S. troops still based in the country as well too, which play some role in this. I know that the people have reported there have been ongoing talks between the new government and the leadership of the SDF about what sort of terms they would acquiesce to or could compromise on to have a political solution to avoid potentially a conflict, a civil war between the government and the SDF in the near future. And I've done some stories talking to other Kurdish-led factions in the country. Some of them, they've said different things. Some of them have said that they'd be happy with some sort of constitutional recognition in a new Syrian constitution of Kurdish identity, which was not the case under the previous constitution, and that led to a lot of suppression of Kurdish identity in the country and other injustices. But I think the SDF's position is more, it's different. I think as I've seen, they have not been in favor of that kind of compromise. Do you know what exactly the SDF wants at the moment, or what their position is in terms of the role they see for themselves and for Rojava in a new Syria now coming into existence?
Well, I would say this. Well, first of all, just to in reference to what you were saying, that there is in fact like some reporting that is insinuating that the talks that are ongoing are being held in a rather cordial climate, cordial atmosphere between the HTS and the SDF. At the same time, from what I understand, let's say, and also having spoken to sources of the ground, it doesn't appear that, as some rumors have it, that that they are in fact very close to a deal. But like I said, at the same time, it seems that that the talks are being held in a good atmosphere. At the same time, what I want to make a distinction here in case of like in terms of the HTS, because there have been also some fake news circulating a lot, which is natural in this kind of situation. And I would say, like let's say for general use here, that excuse me, I see my image frozen. Is everything okay?
I can hear you. I can hear you. You're frozen.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Your voice is,
Okay, I'm seeing. Okay, I hope you can see me as well. So I would say that it is important to be able to sort of, make a distinction, obviously, between, fake news and facts, and I would even say between rhetoric and posturing and facts. And the one thing to note is that there haven't been any clashes between the HTS and the SDF, despite what some recent rumors were insinuating. In fact, all the heavy clashes that have been happening in the north are between the SNA and the HTS. And I do want to take this opportunity to make a distinction here, because clearly the HTS owes a lot to Turkey, and is in many ways is rather attached, has been very attached to Turkey, but it is also at the same time like it is also its own entity. Like it has, and their leader, he has he has a personal political capital, while the SNA, which is the force that has been fighting the SDF, is like it is much more directly, let's say, kind of employees of the Turkish state, like to put it in terms that can be relatable to the audience, well, and a little bit facetiously, perhaps. It could be described as somehow like a Turkey's own rugged version of a Wagner group, or like from Temu, or something. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. So having said that, the SDF has made clear, or the DANS rather, has made clear that they don't have like a separatist agenda, and all the discussions are happening like within that framework. It has also made clear that what they want is like to like, let's say, for all resources, and specifically petroleum resources, to be equally shared throughout the country. And it has also said that they do, in fact, want to reach an agreement by which they will be incorporated into the new Syrian army. But that's the point. But that's where we don't, where I can't, and I don't think anyone can say like exactly what is being discussed. But obviously that's kind of the thorny issue of exactly how, because this is in like it is implied that there are some conditions, that there has to be a certain agreement reached that is kind of keeping some balances, let's say, because certainly at the same time, although they don't want, and they've made this clear from before, by the way, not just now, that they're not seeking any kind of change of borders or anything like that. At the same time, I don't think we should expect them to simply just lay down arms and like sort of, surrender all their gains and achievement to the new government. But like I said in the beginning, like it seems that for now the ongoing talks are going somewhat smoothly.
And I guess I agree with everything. I would just add that since I believe 2016, right before I went, so yeah, like March around 2016, the Democratic Autonomous Administration of Northeast Syria announced that their plan was to federate under Assad in sort of a very similar way to the Kurdistan regional government with Iraq. And basically, when Assad was toppled, within I think maybe 2 or 3 days, they started flying the green revolutionary flag, and sort of, I believe everything I've read and everything I've understood is that same plan from almost a decade ago, that's always been, for those who know, the big plan, unlike, a lot of fake news like Nestor says about separatism and stuff like that, that is still the plan. So I don't think the plan has really changed, despite there being a different person in Damascus. The relationship with Damascus is one that, has existed in Syria for hundreds of years, and it will continue, hopefully.
Maz, I wanted to ask you, actually, you just came back. Well, this is to all of you, but first with Maz, you just came back from Syria. You weren't in the northern region, you're in Damascus, but you visited a bunch of places, including Yarmouk, which is home to the largest Palestinian refugee community in Syria. But you're there just, weeks after the fall of Bashar al-Assad, and talk to us about what you saw on the ground. You did a profile for Dropsite about Sayyidah Zainab Mosque and neighborhood. But, now we're looking at a Syria that is led, Ahmed al-Shar'a, the leader of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, was just named or appointed transitional president of Syria. Of course, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, a group, was formerly linked to Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and we just watched a documentary about the fight against ISIS. What's your impression of what's happening in Syria today, and link it to the struggle that we just saw against ISIS?
Yeah, first and foremost, it's very jarring, the level of devastation in Syria. And anyone who saw Syria before the war and so forth would be very disturbed, I think, by the level of physical destruction of the cities. And, truly, like just the scenes you see in Gaza, for instance, they're played out in many places in Syria, even just in Damascus, in areas which are central to the city, in the suburbs and so forth. It's very devastating. But even in this ostensibly normal areas where there's not that destruction, People are extremely poor. You see a society which has effectively been destroyed in a very comprehensive manner, such that there's no electricity, there's not really water. The food chain, we take for granted these things, but the electricity which allows this refrigerated food chain is broken down, so the quality of the food is very poor, and people are sick. There's all these knock-on effects. Then just the level of loss of people who died or been injured. You can see it very clearly, and it's very difficult. So to see this now, something good has happened, and I think that's an improvement that the government's gone. The government, which was really the source of many of these problems, systematically, people are able to speak now. It's a greater environment of freedom and so forth. But any government that came to power now would have a profound challenge in addressing this problem, just of the devastation of Syrian society, but also how to hold together a country which has been dealing with a civil war for over a decade, and then keeping together the disparate parts of the country. And this issue, the negotiation and the conflict with the SDF and the central government, that's just one of many issues which have to be somehow addressed, hopefully in a constructive manner. So it's just kind of shocking to see what Syria is like, and it just uh, really emphasizes the level of how difficult it's going to be to put the country back together. It's not just the government falls and then things will be okay. It's the beginning of whatever process is now going to come. And I think, Sharif, to your point, it's interesting because, and also Alexis mentioned this too as well. When the civil war started, this Kurdish kind of region was kind of more organized. It was kind of more well placed to operate independently in a political manner and militarily and so forth. And I think that had something to do with the nature of the Ba'athist regime, because it was very oppressive to everybody, in both Kurds and Arabs and everybody else. But to some degree, the Kurdish people, because they weren't Arab and didn't fit into the ideology of the country, they were allowed, even with great repression, some degree of political organization greater than the Arab population, which had to have the Ba'ath Party as their only political representative, period. So when the government sort of lost control and when this all started in 2011, there was a basis to build a political structure on in the Kurdish region, which did not exist in the Arab regions at all, where there was basically zero political capital that people had, and they only were able to rally around the mosque and things like that. So that was the case, and that played out over the last decade and a half. But in the last few years, in Idlib province, there was an independent sort of, you could say, Arab-led political project, which was led by these groups, and there were Islamist groups, and the HCS was the most primary one among them. And they got a chance to experience self-governance and to learn trial and error and how that works and things like that. And it's not to say that the government is necessarily very good. In some cases, people have very legitimate complaints and criticisms of how HCS governed. They governed in a very authoritarian manner in Idlib, but they still learned something from that experience. And then now they're in charge of the whole country, so they have the opportunity to put some of that learning into practice and see what happens. I would say that people are concerned. They're not necessarily overwhelmingly optimistic about it, but they're happy the government's gone. And when I talk to people about it, one thing I thought was encouraging, there's two things. First of all, in Syria before the war, or even during the war, you would notice that Bashar Assad's face was everywhere. Him and his father, their face was on every physical, every building, every car, everywhere. His face was present, because to emphasize psychologically the population that he's in charge and he himself is the state. His face has not been replaced by Ahmed al-Shara's face in Damascus. It's not that people have just replaced that figure with another equally, patriarchal figure. It's something else. And I talk to people about it. I ask them, they're not, people will talk about him. They'll talk about HTS. They'll talk a bit freely, which is also a novelty in Syria. And it's by no means are people blindly praising the government or even blindly criticizing it. They're saying, we'll see. We'll see. We don't know them. We haven't been governed by them before, and we're not necessarily going to vote for them in the elections. We'll see how they do, and then we'll decide. So I thought that was an encouraging sort of response. And even despite all the grave challenges I mentioned, I think that the people they have an opportunity and they have a lot of capacity to take advantage of it.
And Guy or Alexis, do you want to comment at all on Ahmed al-Shara and the political situation now, having been part of a fight against a group that he was formerly linked to?
I have quite a few things to say. Do you want to start, Guy, though?
Yeah, I'll start real quick because I guess, I mean, to your point, yeah, I think that's sort of what that's the reality on the ground, and that's what everyone has to sort of deal with and understand. For me personally, for my ideological background and everything like that, I'm not. I would say that for like a Sunni nationalist to lead to such good things, I'm a soldier. That's who I am. That's my experiences. Like the fact that they have several like former ISIS members in their government or the SNA forces in their government who have been under international criminal court warrants for human trafficking and genocide and all these things. It's a problem for me personally, but I'm not Syrian. I'm not voting. It's not for me. And I hope for the best, and I hope everyone can, put the guns away, and Kurds can go back to Afrin. Everyone from Idlib can go where they need to go, and the best possible situation for Syrians that they can find. Alexis, what do you kick it off to you?
Well, first of all, I would have in terms of making some general remarks on what was said. I would like to highlight a few things in terms of the historical context. One thing to note, I guess, would say that what was like a very sort of important development in how things evolved in the northeast of Syria is that the regime, in fact, just pulled out. Like there was a void. There was a void that the indeed pre-existing Kurdish, predominantly like Kurdish organizing, was able to fill in. Like they were in this sense somewhat fortunate. They grabbed the historical opportunity. I would say. I wouldn't say they were they were quite consistently and historically oppressed as such as a minority, like with many policies like specifically designed for exactly that purpose. So I wouldn't say there was exactly a lot of leeway, but there was a powerful incentive behind it, and that goes all the way back to the early 21st century. And in fact, there is a kind of famous story about some kind of uprising, or you could say like a riot that started after a certain football game in 2004, I think, or three. And there was the formation of the political party and so on. Another thing I really want to mention in terms of what happened like in the very beginning of this whole situation in Syria, is that in fact in the very beginning there was like what we originally came to call the Syrian Revolution, like the original Syrian Revolution. I would say was one of the most remarkable revolutions we've seen. Again, from my own point of view as well, and my the point of view of my ideological convictions. And in fact, I would say the original Syrian revolution was in fact much closer, even, or at least closer to my own ideological convictions than what became known as the Rojava Revolution. And as I've said sometimes before in Q&As, I would even go as far as saying that, which is not even very far. Like in ideologically speaking, I kind of would have preferred to have been able to fight for the Syrian revolution. However, there's two big buts there, which one is that I practically couldn't have had that opportunity because there wasn't this kind of let's say structure that could allow for such an international call out like what happened in northeast Syria is one thing. And the other thing is that, well, I would be dead, so in fact, in that sense, maybe I wouldn't have preferred that because, I obviously I prefer to live. And that is also telling that's okay. I'm not gonna keep going with this because it's also kind of rather specifically addressing a certain political audience. But let's say it is there are some very important lessons, I would say, to look at in terms of kind of what happened there. And how this Syrian revolution, this glorious Syrian revolution, I don't want to say devolved, but kind of like changed in not a very positive way, especially because it didn't like this amazing blossoming of self-organizing, of grassroots organizing, was very unfortunately never able to self-organize the defense. So that was kind of outsourced to groups that had the structural capacity and also the connections to get weapons and so on and so forth. And I'll leave it at that. Now, in terms of like sort of what's going on now and like Al-Jolani and the HTS and so on, I will say this again within the constraints and the limitations of my understanding and my perception. I would say that my impression of Jolani in particular is that I think there is a lot like that. I see him as a rather opportunist element. Like my impression of him is that I am not sure whether and I'm talking about specifically him, and like I'm not sure whether his primary motivation is any ideology or any religious conviction, and I mean more so than his than perhaps his own personal lust for power. And I say this because I would also kind of assume that it's possible that he would agree to any plan or any scenario that would keep him in charge. And we've seen him. I would also say that to some extent we could say he's somewhat charismatic, and it's not by by chance that he found himself on top. And if you look at if you look a little bit at his trajectory, and as much as it is true that yes, he was in ISIS and then Al Qaeda and then not Al Qaeda and so on and so forth, and which is obviously very concerning, but especially for him, like his trajectory could also be seen as quite a remarkable careerist ascent. And to that effect, we can see him being quite a player right now, like being quite a smooth operator in, constantly rebranding and passing himself like quite effectively. But at the same time, while he's right now focusing quite a lot in appealing to the Western powers and the Western audiences, and trying to appear as a moderate, he also has to contend with the fact that a lot of people in his organization are remorseless jihadist thugs, and he has to like kind of address that audience as well. So he's in a rather tricky position as well, that he has to balance also his debts to Turkey, but also as now the man in charge, he has to kind of deal with the whole world, not just, he can't, I don't see how he could only do Turkey's bidding, like he has to keep a lot of balances. So I'm not, like it's hard to predict where this will go, but I think he seems to be sort of playing the game like quite cautiously.
So we had an audience question, sort of more related to the film directly, and the way it was made. So Isabel asked, what made you choose to jump around with the chronology of the film when you were filming, just explaining the story? Because you went back and forth in some places. What was the message behind that, or what was the intention in doing so?
Well, I'll take the opportunity to also say this. On many levels, and like I guess in this sense, even in an almost technical level, like we all, I and personally, and everyone involved, like we tried to make this film as honest as possible. So to that effect, like the film kind of mentions that in the very beginning, that the fact of the matter is that this was Lulu's suggestion. Like being in this insane predicament that I was, like being a soldier and a filmmaker at the same time, which I don't recommend, by the way, to anybody, that it was like quite an insane undertaking. when I returned, and after already like a lot of work put into this, we kind of, and I mean with Lulu, the first like chronologically editor of the film, we kind of stumbled upon a realization that there's something missing, that there's something, that there's a thread. We need like some kind of thread to bind everything together. And we went through various options, and it was Lou who suggested that perhaps the ideal one would be if I could go back to northeast Syria and shoot like a kind of flash forward to every chapter that would going to look at how things have evolved, a kind of update, but also like looking for the progress of the revolution, and so on. And although in the beginning, like, it sounded quite overwhelming that to go back to northeast Syria, and of course it meant that the film was quite delayed as well, as I said, and that was like the pandemic came in the meanwhile, and all that. I want to think it eventually worked out quite well, and that was that was the original motivation, and then eventually, like in terms of narrative building, that was its function as well, like that, to have a flash forward that was referring to more or less the same localities or the same themes in every chapter, after every chapter, like 5 years later.
So I wanted to just ask two more questions, and one I'll just sort of wrap a few audience questions into one, because we had a few that we want to get to, but we want to be cognizant of time as well too. So Alexis and Guy, you mentioned DANES a few times, the autonomous
Democratic Autonomous Administration of Northeast Syria.
Exactly.
It's a mouthful, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Car salesman.
We've practiced saying it fast.
We do.
Yeah, you guys used to say exactly. So I want to ask you, well, the audience wanted to ask you, can you explain first, just briefly, what that is, and how it evolved from the YPG and SDF in the course of the war, and as part of that, someone else asked, but also add on to this, how are they armed? Like, how did they get drones and mines and all these things? And finally, how many IFB volunteers actually died in Syria during the course of the war?
I'll take a few of those. I think, let me work my way backwards, just because of my memory. As far as IFB members directly in Syria, because of course, being a revolutionary international organization, many have died in Iraq and Turkey as well, with their movements separately, and I mean obviously in Europe too, and other places. It's been almost 10 years. I would say in Syria, around 2025. Would you agree with that, Alexis? Something around that.
It seems a bit high, but to be honest, I cannot calculate this right now. I would say probably also, a little bit less than that, but yeah.
It's hard to say, because like there's groups like, for example, the MLKP, which would send some fighters to the IFB.
Yeah, exactly. Like,
and then they also have their own battalion where they would fight. Exactly. So tracking it exactly, but like personally, like my little Shaheed wall is over 30. So I would say that that's basically more or less my number personally of people I've known. And then working back to funding. So sort of, we alluded to it a little bit here, but it's best to directly talk about it. The political formation that existed before and under the Ba'athist state, in sort of a Cold War geopolitical game between Assad, who was sort of more Warsaw, and Turkey, who's more NATO, is that the PKK was allowed to basically function and be sort of like a foreign representative of Kurds. Kurds weren't allowed to be Syrian citizens. They were thought to be from this place in Turkey that would then be liberated at some point, similar to Palestinians in many states in the region. So I think after what Alexis said of the Kamishlo Saka riot in 2004, the PYD was formed illegally with the idea of being like, hey, like our relationship with Assad has really deteriorated. Like, we're going to get to a point someday where we're going to have to do something. So they stored a lot of weapons, mostly just rifles, maybe a few Belkî machine guns, like small arms. And then when the revolution happened and the troops withdrew, they got a little bit more arms. But then by the time that me and Alexis was there, we were really, I would say, not very well armed at all. Like, we were definitely way worse armed than ISIS or any of these people who, like Alexis said, got money from America for guns through the FSA and many other factors. And so we basically, like in our battalion, we got a lot of like battlefield pickups. Like my my M16 that I used in Raqqa was taken in Manbij. It still had like the ISIS symbol on it, or like where it was. And yeah, I think that's the main thing. We did get later in the Raqqa administration, I believe, was it? Yeah, it was in Raqqa that we got some Zastava AKs from the U.S. Do you remember that, Alexis? So they weren't very good. They were like what compared to like we're fighting dudes who get funding from Gulf states, who get thermals, like top end military equipment, and we sort of have the lower rank of everything. I'll pass it over to you, Alexis. I think was that all the questions or close to them? I'll let you answer the rest.
Yeah, I'll just like add a few things that overall, like there is like a sort of global network to begin with of like the Kurdish liberation movement, which has some considerable capacity to generate revenue for that matter. At the same time, there is also an even wider network of like a support base for the Kurdish liberation movement, like much beyond the diaspora, that is, which also got activated and involved. I even remember, like Germany is a good example. Like there was this quite big initiative called like quite brazenly, let's say, Waffen für Rojava, yeah, like weapons for Rojava, like back then. And just from the top of my head, like just an example, as there are now, as there is also again in Germany, by the way, an initiative called drones for Rojava. So this sort of thing going on. Obviously, at the same time, what's also I guess good to mention is that things evolved. Like as Guy was saying, like in the very beginning, things were more grim for us. Let's say that we were much less well equipped, and the more we were winning and advancing, all conditions were becoming better. Obviously, having said all that, like we've already covered this, but to reiterate it here, as we said, the SDF from a certain point onwards had the backing of the international coalition against ISIS. So obviously, a lot of the weapons and equipment, like not just like also cars, a lot of cars.
Yeah.
For some reason, Toyota is like seems to be the preferred. Toyota Hilux is okay. This is not like whatever, like a what you call product placement or something, but it is kind of funny. It's like an inside joke. Anyone who's been there knows, like somehow it's like the preferred vehicle of like regional conflicts. That's the real Toyota phone, yeah. So all this sort of equipment was also incoming from the coalition, yeah. And also at the same time, like there was some amount of oil revenue, although as the film suggests, that was actually quite limited and was most often used in its crude form, mazout, yeah, as we would often say there, because actually in the film it is kind of referenced the Kurds in that moment. But I would say like the ANS back then and the ANS now did lack the capacity for refining the oil. So that was not as much as you would expect, but it was sort of also directly being used as mazout, like into the cars, to the detriment of those cars, really. But what can you do? So yeah, that's like obviously these kind of questions could be answered in much lengthier ways, but like that's a little bit of like the gist of it.
No, that's great. So I want to ask just one final question for Alexis. What would you like people who watch this film to take away from it, or what's the message you'd like people to come away with? Obviously, you lived through these very incredible events and you documented them. What's the story? What's the moral of the story for you, or what people should take away from Rojava and Belkî Sibê?
Well, I would reference like I could say many things, but I would reference at least a couple of things. One is what, like, I guess they both to some extent actually, okay, to be honest, not even honest, like pragmatic. As much as this film wants to, and I do like actively want to like, and it is to some extent made in that way, like as much as possible, to be able to address an as wide audience as possible. Like to some extent, if we're pragmatic, it does primarily address a left-wing audience. Yeah. So to that effect, I think what has been quite poignantly said in the film by Americans, by the way, in this case, obviously there was a lot of nationalities, but quite a few Americans as well. Is I guess this this desire expressed for experiencing victory, because the fact of the matter is that in most people's experience, the experience of being in the left is very often one of defeat. Well, for the past several decades, you might say, like in the West and so on, and this was like kind of I guess an important example that we can also be victorious within the historical context that these sort of things happen, and with all that entails. And that would lead me to this next and kind of perhaps more like overall point, which is how the film ends, which is like the film ends referencing hope. And I want to think that this was indeed, like, people did come to North Syria, like sort of looking for a hopeful paradigm, in an era where in many places there is a mentality that of like a consolidation of the notion that there is no alternative, that this is it, like that, whatever, like the time, like the revolutions and like whatever, like social, like radical social transformation is like a kind of a romantic thing of the past, or whatever. I guess this revolution is a little reminder is a little reminder that history doesn't end. There's no such thing as an end of history, and everything is still possible. Everything is still open, and as a kind of Greek saying goes, like everything we've talked in the past still goes, so to speak. Like the case is still open, and there is hope. There is hope for like even for real revolutions to happen in this day and age.
Oh, I love that. That's great. Okay, well, thank you so much. Thank you, Alexis and Guy, and thank you, Sharif, for a colleague, for joining us as well too. And for all our viewers and subscribers, thank you so much. We can't do this without you, and particularly those who subscribe. We're able to become paid subscribers of Dropsite. That's what allows us to do screenings like this, allows us to do the reporting that is so important and is enjoyed by so many of you. So please, if you can, become a paid subscriber. And thank you so much for tuning in. And I hope that Belkî Sibê will be seen by a broader audience of people, because the things that are discussed in this film are still very, very relevant to what's going on in Syria today and will be in the future. And as Alexis said, even beyond Syria, just a general idea of political change and progressive change as well too. So thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you at the next Dropsite movie night sometime in the near future.